The old Whispering Pines Sanatorium stood on the outskirts of Millfield, its decaying facade a stark reminder of a bygone era. Once a bustling medical facility, it had been abandoned for over 40 years, left to crumble under the weight of time and neglect. Ivy crawled up its weathered walls, nature slowly reclaiming what man had built. The locals avoided it, whispering tales of strange noises and flickering lights seen through broken windows on moonless nights. I never believed those stories. As a journalist specializing in debunking urban legends, I'd heard it all before. Every small town had its haunted house, its cursed bridge, its phantom hitchhiker. Millfield was no different, except perhaps in the intensity with which residents clung to their superstitions about the old hospital. "You're making a mistake, Ms. Chen," Mrs. Holloway warned as she poured me coffee in the town's only diner. Her weathered hands trembled slightly. "Some places are best left alone." I smiled politely. "I appreciate your concern, but I've investigated dozens of supposedly haunted locations. I've never found anything but old buildings and overactive imaginations." She leaned closer. "It's not just ghost stories. People have gone missing. Teenagers looking for thrills, urban explorers with their fancy cameras." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Not all of them came back." "I'll be careful," I promised, though I didn't take her warnings seriously. Missing persons could be explained by many things, running away from small-town life being the most common. The following morning, I parked my car at the base of the hill and hiked the overgrown path to the hospital. My backpack contained the essentials: camera, voice recorder, flashlight, extra batteries, water, and a first aid kit. Standard equipment for exploring abandoned buildings, where the real dangers were rusty nails and collapsing floors, not supernatural entities. Whispering Pines was larger than I expected. 5 stories of institutional architecture sprawled across the hillside, with a separate building that must have been staff quarters. Most of the windows were broken, and graffiti marked the walls near the entrance. Typical teenage vandalism: names, dates, crude drawings, and the occasional "turn back" or "beware" added for dramatic effect. The main entrance doors hung partially off their hinges. I slipped through the gap into a cavernous lobby. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. A reception desk still stood, drawers hanging open and empty. Above it, a faded sign directed visitors to various departments: pediatrics, surgery, psychiatric wing, morgue. I took photographs, documenting the decay. The place was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water and the rustle of small animals scurrying in the walls. Standard abandoned building ambiance. The first floor yielded little of interest. Administrative offices mostly, picked clean by scavengers over the decades. Filing cabinets stood with drawers ajar, their contents long gone. I found a patient logbook from 1968 in one office, the pages water-damaged and mostly illegible. I carefully photographed what entries I could make out. The second floor housed what appeared to be general patient rooms. Rusted bed frames remained bolted to the floors in some. In others, only the outline where they had once stood remained visible in the grime. I stepped carefully, testing each section of floor before putting my full weight on it. It was in one of these rooms that I found the first strange item: a child's teddy bear, far too new to have been left when the hospital closed. Its fur was clean, unstained by the dust that covered everything else. Someone had been here recently. Probably teenagers, I reasoned, though why they'd bring a stuffed animal was unclear. By mid-afternoon, I'd explored 3 floors and was beginning to think Mrs. Holloway's warnings were as substantial as all the others I'd received in similar towns. which is to say, not at all. I'd found evidence of visitors, certainly. Fresh footprints in the dust, a couple of empty beer cans, cigarette butts, but nothing supernatural or even particularly unsettling. Then I found the stairwell to the 5th floor. Unlike the other staircases, this one was blocked by a makeshift barricade of broken furniture. Someone had gone to considerable effort to discourage visitors from ascending. Naturally, this only piqued my curiosity. I dismantled enough of the barricade to squeeze through, careful not to cause a collapse. The stairwell was darker here, the windows either boarded up or painted over. I switched on my flashlight, casting long shadows across the peeling walls. The temperature dropped noticeably as I climbed. I attributed it to poor ventilation and continued upward, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. At the top, a heavy metal door stood slightly ajar. It bore no room number or identifying marker, just a series of deep scratches in the metal that could have been made by anything from maintenance equipment to desperate fingernails. I pushed the door open, wincing at the high-pitched squeal of rusted hinges. The sound seemed to reverberate endlessly down the corridor beyond. The 5th floor was different. While the lower floors showed signs of random decay and vandalism, this level appeared almost untouched by time. The walls were clean, the floors swept. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, which was impossible. The power had been cut decades ago. And yet, the lights buzzed and blinked, casting a sickly glow across the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steady despite the unease building in my chest. "Is anyone here?" Only silence answered, though the lights flickered more rapidly, as if in response. I moved down the corridor, documenting everything with my camera. The rooms off the main hallway were patient rooms, but unlike those below, these contained restraints on the beds. Thick leather straps with heavy buckles, designed to immobilize occupants. A psychiatric ward then. That explained the security measures. Mental health treatment in the mid-20th century had been primitive at best, barbaric at worst. In one room, I found a patient chart, somehow preserved while similar documents downstairs had rotted away. The pages detailed the case of a 16-year-old girl named Emily Winters, admitted in 1962 for recurrent hallucinations and violent episodes. The treatments listed made me wince. Electroshock therapy, insulin shock therapy, and experimental medications with names I didn't recognize. The final entry, dated October 17, 1964, simply read, "Patient transferred to secure isolation following incident with Nurse Radcliffe. No further treatment recommended." I photographed the chart and continued exploring. At the end of the hall stood another door, heavier than the others, with a small observation window reinforced with wire mesh. The secure isolation room, presumably. I hesitated before this door, a chill running up my spine that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. Something felt wrong. The perfectly functioning lights, the preserved documents, the clean floors, none of it made sense in a building abandoned for 4 decades. Professional curiosity won out over instinct. I tried the handle, locked. I shone my flashlight through the observation window. The room beyond was small and windowless, its walls padded with stained, tattered material. A single bed stood in the center, its restraints undone and hanging toward the floor. There was something on the bed, a figure under a sheet. My heart hammered against my ribs. It had to be a mannequin or a prank, I told myself. Someone trying to scare urban explorers. As if sensing my presence, the sheet moved. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. This was impossible. The sheet had definitely shifted, rising slightly as if whatever lay beneath had taken a breath. I backed away from the door, reasoning with myself. It could be an animal that had found its way in and made a nest. Or perhaps a draft had disturbed the sheet. There were rational explanations. Then I heard the voice. "Help me." It was faint, barely audible, a raspy whisper that might have been the wind through broken windows. Except there were no broken windows on this floor. "Who's there?" I called, proud that my voice remained steady. "Please." The words seemed to emanate from behind the locked door. "I've been waiting so long. I should have left." Every instinct screamed to run, to get off this floor, out of this building, and never look back. Instead, I found myself stepping forward, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. "Who are you?" I asked, my flashlight trained on the observation window. "Emily." The voice was clearer now. "Emily Winters. They left me here." The name from the patient chart. This couldn't be happening. "That's impossible," I said aloud. Emily Winters would be in her 70s now, if she's even still alive. A soft laugh drifted through the door. "Time moves differently here. Please, the key is in Radcliffe's office. You have to let me out." "I'm leaving now," I said firmly, taking a step back. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging the hallway into darkness, except for the beam of my flashlight. "You can't leave!" The voice was no longer soft or pleading. It rose to a shriek that reverberated through the corridor. "None of you can leave!" The door to the isolation room began to shake, the metal frame rattling against its hinges. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I made or the dust I kicked up. Behind me, the pounding against the door grew louder, accompanied by screams that no human throat could produce. I reached the stairwell and practically fell down the steps, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. The barricade I dismantled earlier was back in place, more substantial than before, blocking my exit. That was impossible. I'd been alone up here. I tackled the pile of furniture, throwing pieces aside desperately. Above me, I heard the isolation room door burst open, followed by shuffling footsteps in the corridor. Breaking through the barricade, I raced down to the 4th floor, not slowing until I reached a long hallway lined with doors. I needed to hide, to catch my breath, to make sense of what was happening. I ducked into the nearest room and closed the door quietly behind me. It appeared to be some kind of treatment room. Ancient equipment stood covered in dust, their functions mysterious and menacing in the beam of my flashlight. In the center of the room was an examination chair with restraints, surrounded by machines with dials and switches. Electroshock therapy equipment, I realized with a shudder. On a table nearby lay a folder. Unlike the other papers I'd found, this one seemed newly placed, its cover free of dust. The label read, "Incident Report, Nurse Radcliffe." I shouldn't touch it, I thought. I should focus on escaping. But my journalist's curiosity, that same drive that had brought me here, compelled me forward. The report detailed an attack on a nurse named Margaret Radcliffe by patient Emily Winters in October 1964. According to the document, Emily had become violent during an electroshock treatment, somehow breaking free of her restraints and attacking Nurse Radcliffe with a scalpel. The nurse had suffered fatal wounds before orderlies could subdue the patient. The final paragraph chilled me to the bone. Patient Winters shows no remorse for her actions. She claims Nurse Radcliffe was experimenting on patients after hours, conducting unauthorized procedures. These allegations are unfounded and clearly the product of patient's delusional state. Given the severity of the incident, it is recommended that patient Winters be permanently confined to secure isolation in Ward 5. A newspaper clipping was attached to the report. The headline read, "Tragic accident at Whispering Pines. Fire claims lives." The article, dated December 3rd, 1964, reported that a fire had broken out in the psychiatric wing, killing 5 patients who had been unable to escape due to being restrained or locked in their rooms. One of the victims was identified as Emily Winters, age 18. I put down the folder with trembling hands. If Emily had died in 1964, what had I been speaking to? A noise in the hallway snapped me back to my present danger. Shuffling footsteps approached, accompanied by the sound of metal dragging across the floor. I extinguished my flashlight and crouched behind one of the machines, making myself as small as possible. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I held my breath, praying whatever was out there would move on. The door creaked open. In the dim light filtering through dirty windows, I saw a figure in a hospital gown, its back to me. Long, matted hair hung down to its waist. One hand gripped what appeared to be a scalpel, its blade catching the meager light. "I know you're in here." The voice was Emily's, but distorted, as if multiple people were speaking at once. "I can smell your fear." The figure moved further into the room, head swiveling unnaturally as it searched for me. I remained frozen, not daring to move a muscle. "You shouldn't have come here," Emily continued, running the scalpel along the edge of a table, creating a high-pitched scraping sound. "But now that you're here, you can help me, just like the others." Others? The missing urban explorers Mrs. Holloway had mentioned? "They didn't believe me either," the figure said, as if reading my thoughts. "About what Radcliffe did to us, the experiments. They thought I was crazy." A bitter laugh echoed through the room. Maybe I was, but that doesn't mean I was wrong. The figure turned, and I got my first clear look at Emily Winters. Her face was gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Burn scars covered one side of her face and neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her gown. "She deserved to die," Emily hissed. "But they punished me. Left me locked up when the fire started. Let me burn." She touched the scarred side of her face. "But I didn't die. Not completely. And now I'm going to show you what she did to us." She moved toward the examination chair, placing one hand almost lovingly on the restraints. Come out, wherever you are. It won't hurt. For long." I needed to escape, but she stood between me and the door. My eyes darted around the room, seeking another exit. There, a second door in the corner, partially concealed behind a cabinet. If I could reach it. Moving as silently as possible, I began to edge toward it, keeping the bulky equipment between myself and Emily. She continued to talk, her voice rising and falling in a sing-song manner as she described Nurse Radcliffe's experiments in disturbing detail. I reached the cabinet and began to inch around it. Just a few more steps to the door. My foot caught on something, a tray of ancient medical instruments that clattered to the floor with an almighty crash. Emily's head snapped toward me, her eyes widening. "There you are!" I abandoned stealth and lunged for the door, yanking it open and plunging through. Instead of finding another room or hallway, I stumbled into a narrow maintenance passage. Pipes ran along the ceiling, and the air was thick with dust and the smell of mold. I ran blindly, hearing Emily crash into the passage behind me. The maintenance tunnel twisted and turned, occasionally branching. I chose directions at random, focused solely on putting distance between myself and my pursuer. The passage eventually opened into a larger room filled with massive boilers and water tanks, the hospital's old heating system. Dim light filtered through grime-covered windows near the ceiling. At least I'd reached the ground floor. I weaved between the machinery, searching for an exit. Behind me, Emily's voice echoed off the metal surfaces, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You can't leave! None of them could leave!" I spotted a door on the far wall and sprinted toward it, heart pounding. As I reached for the handle, a scalpel embedded itself in the wood beside my head. I whirled around. Emily stood 20 feet away, another scalpel already in her hand. Impossible. No one could throw with such accuracy. "I just want to help you understand," she said, her voice suddenly gentle. "What it was like for us. What they did to us." "The hospital closed 40 years ago," I said, trying to reason with her, to buy time. "Whatever happened here is over." She tilted her head, the movement too fluid, too extreme to be natural. "Over? Not for me. Not for the others." "Others?" As if on cue, figures began to emerge from behind the boilers and tanks. Patients in hospital gowns, some with visible injuries or deformities, staff in blood-stained uniforms, all with the same hollow-eyed stare as Emily. "We've been waiting for someone to listen," Emily said. "Someone to tell our story." "I'll tell it," I promised desperately. "I'm a journalist. I can make people know what happened here." Emily approached slowly, the crowd of spectral patients and staff parting to let her through. "Words on paper aren't enough. You need to experience it." She raised the scalpel. "Like we did." I fumbled with the door handle behind me, finally getting it open. Cool night air rushed in. I'd been in the hospital for hours without realizing it. Darkness had fallen outside. Emily lunged forward with inhuman speed. I barely dodged the scalpel, feeling it slash through my jacket sleeve. I stumbled backward through the doorway and slammed it shut in her face. I ran across the overgrown grounds toward the path that would lead to my car, not daring to look back. Behind me, I heard the door burst open, followed by dozens of shuffling footsteps. Halfway down the hill, I risked a glance over my shoulder. Emily stood at the hospital entrance, surrounded by her ghostly companions. They weren't pursuing me further. Instead, they simply watched, their hollow eyes reflecting the moonlight. Emily raised one scarred hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert the key. As the engine roared to life, I looked up at the hospital on the hill. Lights blazed from every window of the 5th floor. 3 months have passed since my visit to Whispering Pines. The photographs I took on the lower floors developed normally, showing exactly what I'd seen, an abandoned, decaying hospital. But the images from the 5th floor show only empty corridors and rooms. No signs of the clean floors, functioning lights, or occupied isolation room. The patient records I photographed, including Emily Winters' chart, came out as blank, illegible smudges. I'd assumed my voice recorder would likewise fail to provide evidence of my experience, but it contained something perhaps more disturbing. Nearly an hour of static, occasionally broken by whispers too faint to make out, and at one point, a girl's laughter. I've researched the hospital's history extensively since my escape. There was indeed a fire in 1964 that claimed several lives, including a patient named Emily Winters. And there are newspaper articles about a nurse named Margaret Radcliffe who was fatally attacked by a patient, though details are sparse. Most unsettling of all, I've discovered records of at least 7 people who went missing while exploring Whispering Pines over the past 4 decades. The most recent disappearance was just last year. A 22-year-old urban explorer named Jason Mills. I've written this account not as a journalist debunking urban legends, but as a warning. Some stories persist not because of superstition or overactive imaginations, but because they contain truth. Whispering Pines Sanatorium is not just an abandoned building. Whatever happened there in the 1960s left a stain that time has not erased. Emily Winters and the others are still there, waiting for someone to listen to their story, or perhaps to join them in telling it. I won't be returning to confirm my suspicions. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some histories better left unexamined. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear Emily's voice whispering from the shadows of my bedroom. "Come back," she says. "We have so much more to show you." And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to listen.